Wow, street lights hanging down. Looks like somebody took a pole out on the corner. Damn. Uh,
Between the far left woke ideology of oppressor and oppressed and ends justifying the means when it comes to these types of tactics, and what that means with regards to Israel and their positions with regards to their own fellow students on campus who happen to be Jewish.
So, Charisse, what is the root of this violent anti-Semitism, as evidenced by the student who was arrested at Cornell for wanting to shoot up an area, a building that was often used by Jewish students?
Well, I think what we're ultimately seeing here is the culmination of this concept that ends justify the means. And the reason I bring that up is because it is so crucial to the far left kind of woke ideology. You have over 30% of college students in a recent survey saying that they think it's okay to use violence against people who have speech that they disagree with. So they, again, they're willing to take this much further, and it comes back to this kind of this root and this stem of where this ideology comes from, in that they are operating in a very rigid viewpoint that doesn't make room for nuance, that only creates an incredible amount of division through identitarian politics by separating people into groups. And we can trace this all the way back to Marxist ideology, where you put people into, like we mentioned, groups of oppressor and oppressed.
But just briefly here, Charisse, what can parents and students do to prevent harm from anti-Semitism on campus?
Well, we've seen a lot of response from the alumni and the donor community with regards to what's been going on campus. Look, there's nothing stopping universities from condemning terrorism. The fact that they hesitated on this front should be very telling about where their positions lie on a lot of these issues. And I think parents should really take note of that. You know, the Ivy Leagues are at the center of all of this. They're supposed to be the most elite institutions in higher education, and they're the ones that struggled the most to figure out how to approach the situation, because either they feared the woke mob on their campus, or they actually believe in that political agenda that the mob actually wants to pursue. So I think parents need to second guess about like what actually qualifies as an elite institution, start reevaluating what virtues and what traits they want their students to come out, or their children to come out of college with, and understand that maybe it's worth looking into other alternatives, such as University of Austin or Hillsdale, or some of these colleges that really espouse concepts like free speech and expression, but also don't put Jews in a position where they actually fear for their lives on college campuses.
Charisse Trump, Executive Director of Speech First, thank you for your time.
Also located in operational headquarters with Hamas communications and military materials.
These weapons have absolutely no business being inside a hospital. The only reason they're here is because Hamas put them here, because they use this place, like many other hospitals and ambulances and sensitive facilities inside the Gaza Strip, for their illicit military purposes. So there's Kalashnikov rifles here, even ammunition.
In a video posted on social media, the Israeli military gave viewers a closer look at how Hamas terrorists hid their military gear among medical equipment.
In military terms, this is a grab bag, grab and go of a Hamas combatant. And if you zoom in and we get some light over here, what you will be able to see is military equipment. There is an AK-47, there are cartridges, ammo, there are grenades in here, of course uniforms, and all of this was hidden very conveniently, secretly behind the MRI machine.
In another post on social media, Israeli Defense Forces confirmed they have successfully delivered incubators, baby food, and medical supplies to Al-Shifa Hospital. The military added their medical team and Arabic-speaking soldiers are on the ground to ensure that these supplies reach those in need. Palestinian authorities proposed a supervised evacuation of the hospital on Tuesday. Hundreds of patients remain in the hospital, including dozens of premature babies. The Hamas-backed Gaza Health Ministry said 40 patients, including 3 babies, have died since the hospital's emergency generator ran out of fuel on Saturday. And in terms of fuel supplies in Gaza, Israeli defense officials early Wednesday let in some 6,300 gallons of fuel from Rafah crossing. Also, nearly 650 people, mostly dual nationals, were allowed into Egypt. The fuel is the first delivery allowed in since Hamas killed 1,200 Israelis and took some 200 hostages. Israel previously said it won't allow supplies in until the hostages are freed. The fuel will only be used for the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees. And staying in the Middle East, the U.S. Navy said its warship shot down a drone in the Red Sea launched from Yemen. This appeared to be only the second time the U.S. has brought down projectiles near its warship since the Israeli-Hamas war began. Reporting by Allison Lee, NTD News.
Palestinians dies in the conflict. Canadian-born Vivian Silver moved to Israel in 1970s and became a dominant proponent of peace in the Middle East. Loved ones believed Silver was among the more than 200 hostages being held in the Gaza Strip. But now her body has been identified, nearly a month after Hamas launched its initial attack on Israel on October 7th. Her family told Israel Radio Today that Silver will be remembered as a giant spirit who worked tirelessly for peace. Meanwhile, back in the States, the war's impact is showing. Protesters calling for a ceasefire in Gaza took over the rotunda in the federal building in Oakland, California on Monday. Now, the protest was part of a nationwide series of protests calling for peace and a ceasefire in the Middle East. The group, Jewish Voice for Peace, had as many as 600 people on hand. As protesters took over the building, federal employees were forced to leave. By 8 o'clock that night, police started arresting those who refused to leave. The protest is significant because the Bay Area is the site of this week's Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit, where President Biden is arriving today. Meanwhile, over 100 people arrested in downtown Chicago on Monday, calling for a ceasefire. Videos posted to X show hundreds of people chanting, "Ceasefire now," and "If we don't get it, shut it down." The protest lasted for about 4 hours, with hundreds of Jewish peace activists and allies.
What is
Many of whom
going
traveled
on
from
here?
Milwaukee, Kansas City, Detroit, and Indianapolis.
That doesn't make any sense.
In our nation's capital,
Jews, that 3,000 Chinese Christians came to Jerusalem for that event. I don't think 3 of them could come today. You have the forced closure, you have sometimes the destruction of churches, you have a pressure on the content of sermons, etc., etc. And we'll have to see whether it's brought up and in the pecking order of issues raised, whether it's just brought out with one foot out the door or it's made a part of the central policy. And I just like sort of to point out historically, this isn't the first time that the Wiesenthal Center and other human groups are urging a president of the United States to take on parallel multiple issues. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union, which is basically Russia, they had years of negotiations and discussions on trying to bring down the level of the nuclear threat. But eventually the U.S. at all of these meetings would also bring up the human rights situation inside the Soviet Union. And eventually it made a huge difference. Most people in Asia, maybe all countries, people respect strength. And strength is not only measured in how many missiles you have and what size Navy, but it's also a matter of your moral GPS.
Rabbi, the White House also touched on AI technologies and, the nuclear threats. But when it comes to human rights, not just inside China, but even here in America, the Chinese Communist Party has been described as a transnational criminal organization, including repression overseas. What would you like to see the U.S. touch on in that aspect?
Well, I wouldn't say I was victim of a criminal act, but I was last year here at the campus of University of Southern California during a memorial program for Chinese citizens who died in a fire, having been locked in during COVID. That the 200 or so Chinese students who were there all wore full face masks. And that's when it hit me that the reason they were doing so is they were afraid about facial recognition and what might happen to their families back home. I was just at an international conference on behalf of the Uyghurs in Tokyo, met with Japanese officials. They also have problems of Chinese police and other methods in order to strong-arm Chinese citizens and expats all over the world, which they can now do a lot more powerfully, unfortunately, with the use of AI and other technologies. So again, in each of these areas, it's not that these other issues aren't important, but the American administration, Japan, UK, France, Canada, they need to start intermingling and weaving the human rights issues into the economic and geopolitical issues.
And Rabbi, we're seeing calls from the Uyghur population, Tibetans, House Christians, and also the Falun Gong spiritual discipline calling on President Biden to send a strong message to Chinese regime leader Xi Jinping when it comes to human rights. What is that message that the U.S. should be sending?
I think the message needs to be sent is that we're not only committed to human rights at home here in the United States, and we're so lucky to have these freedoms, but these are now, they're embedded in universal action. And think about it, so much of the discussion is about cooperation, about technology and harnessing the environment in the right direction, all important goals. So you cannot say, no, we're only going to talk about what's inside your borders if it comes to human dignity, but when it comes to controlling CO2 emissions, then we can talk about what's going on all over the world. You know, there is a pollution of the environment, and then there's a moral pollution. So when the U.S. shows also its moral backbone, it impacts in a positive way across the board. And without the United States fronting on these issues, the signal that will be taken by the Chinese communists is they don't really care very much, and we can just continue our pernicious policies in this area without much worry.
Definitely a lot at stake here. Rabbi Abraham Cooper, thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure.
Terrorists around the world have been using that event to inspire and rally one another. And at the same time, we've seen 172 people on the terrorist watch list come across the U.S. border in the fiscal year ending September 30th. And that's just the ones we know about. We do know that there have been 1.7 million known gotaways. Mark Green mentioned 8 million known gotaways, actually, but in his report that he released to the public, he said 1.7 million. And you know, these are people that we don't know who they are. They're just coming across the border. We know that they have come across the border, but we don't know who they are. And among those could be even more people on the terror watch list. So you know, we really just don't know what could be happening right here in our country.
That's right, and Congressman Green also mentioned regarding the border the issue of fentanyl and cartels, discussing how the cartels distract Border Patrol at the border to traffic in, obviously, humans, but also drugs, which then go on to be the leading cause of death for young people aged 25 to 40, I believe. So there's a real issue here right within our border. We do know that a lot of these people were released into the interior and may never show up to their appointments with CBP.
That's right. And coming back to that fentanyl issue, you know, it's estimated about 70,000 people have died from fentanyl overdoses in the past. In 2022, I believe it was. That's significantly more than the number of soldiers that died in the Vietnam War. We'll also hear about other threats to homeland security. I mentioned the nuclear threat. We know that China is buying oil from Iran despite sanctions on Iran, and to the tune of $80 billion in recent years. And Iran itself is known as the largest state sponsor of terror here by the U.S. State Department.
Right, and we also heard just now about foreign state threats, state actors. So Iran obviously being an enemy of the U.S., but we also heard about the Chinese Communist Party in some way. Green mentioned the tensions in the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea. There are many areas regarding the Chinese Communist Party that present a threat to the homeland. We'll likely hear more about those, but this issue with Iran is getting more funds through selling its oil and also through recent sales to other nations that have been where sanctions have been waived. So the U.S. does play a role in many of these external international relations as well.
Right, and coming back to the threat of terrorism, I mean, everybody remembers 9/11. Over 3,000 American citizens died that day, and all it takes is one person or a handful of people here to make something like that happen again. So this issue is highly important, which is why we're tuning into this hearing. We'll have more on the hearing on worldwide threats to Homeland Security after the break.
I gotta go renew my ID. Fun!
The rising threat of terrorism, rogue nation-state actors, and criminal elements seeking to do us harm, and efforts by foreign adversaries like the Chinese Communist Party to target our critical infrastructure. Of course, we also have the wars in Israel and Ukraine, and rising Chinese aggression in the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea. To overcome these significant challenges, we must take a clear-eyed and holistic look at these threats. First, we're facing an unprecedented crisis at our southwest border. In just 3 years, the administration has systematically dismantled our nation's border security and created the worst border crisis in American history. While my friends on the left defend these actions, though now maybe less so than they did at the start, it is clear that this crisis is not the result of budget cuts, changes in Border Patrol resources, or changes in the immigration laws passed by Congress. What has changed was the cancellation of effective policies that had secured our borders. The Biden administration ended proven policies like Remain in Mexico, asylum cooperative agreements, and construction of new border wall systems. As a result, people tested the system, were released into the country, called home, and millions more came. A lot like a college town bar that doesn't card. Before long, they have a line out the door. Worse, as acknowledged by AG Garland, Attorney General Garland, the drug cartels have taken advantage of this policy shift and executed a strategy pushing mass waves of people to tie up Border Patrol and then bypass them with thousands of pounds of fentanyl, killing Americans at an unprecedented rate. Worse, as acknowledged by Attorney General Garland, the drug cartels have taken advantage of this policy shift and executed a strategy that is basically resulting in mass human trafficking. Under Secretary Mayorkas, we just saw a record-breaking year for illegal immigration. CBP reported 2.47 million alien encounters along the southwest border in fiscal year 2023. Since taking office, Secretary Mayorkas has overseen more than 6.5 million southwest border encounters, 7.8 million nationwide encounters, and more than 1.8 million known gotaways, all records. To put this into perspective, the number of illegal immigrants who've entered our country since President Biden took office is greater than the population of 33 of our nation's states. I'll repeat that. More than 33 out of our 50 states. Furthermore, under Secretary Mayorkas, violent Mexican cartels are making record profits. In fact, the New York Times reported that cartels earned around $500 million a year in 2018 on human smuggling. Today, they earn an estimated $13 billion. The failure of this administration's border policies has created a humanitarian and national security crisis as transnational criminal organizations prey on vulnerable migrants and sneak across violent felons and individuals on the terrorist watch list. And yet, Secretary Mayorkas has continued to mislead Congress and the American people, claiming that this is what a secure border looks like. Second, malicious activity by nation-state actors and terrorism poses a direct threat to the United States homeland. Without question, the homeland is less safe under this president. The catastrophic Afghanistan withdrawal 2 years ago signaled weakness and a lack of leadership to the world. Our nation's adversaries have been emboldened to attack our allies and our friends and are undermining our security here at home. Significant threats to our cities and our local communities are only growing. As each of you recently testified before the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs, foreign terrorist organizations, including those supported by Tehran, have gained a sense of momentum following Hamas's brutal terrorist attack against Israel last month. These terrorist organizations continue to call for attacks against the U.S. at home and abroad. This includes Al-Qaeda, which, as Director Wray has pointed out, has issued its most specific call to attack the U.S. in the last 5 years. As our adversaries seek to further destabilize the Middle East, we must confront how these threats directly impact our own homeland security. According to DHS, 294 aliens whose name appear on the terrorist watch list were stopped trying to cross our southwest border between ports of entry since FY 2021. Compare that with 11 individuals stopped in the 4 years before FY 2017 through 2020.
We are tuned into the House hearing. APEC summit, meaning, of course, of the policies to try to clean up the city. It did not really been working. And in other news, Xi Jinping, the head of the Chinese Communist Party, is up to something very strange right now on his upcoming visit to the United States and his tours here. Now, I want to go into first why the military is having trouble recruiting patriots. Essentially, right now, the U.S. military is facing a recruiting crisis. It seems the American people are not only not wanting to join the armed forces, but many are also now saying they would not fight for the country even if a major war broke out. This is based on a poll that found that close to 70% of Americans are now saying they would be unwilling to volunteer to serve if a major conflict broke out. This is according to Newsweek. The figures come as all branches of the armed forces have in recent years struggled to meet their recruitment targets, suggesting a growing apathy towards a career of military service. In 2023, the Army and Air Force fell short of their respective goals by around 10,000 recruits, while the Navy was under by 6,000. Since 1987, the number of active duty personnel has fallen by 39%. It says a poll by the Research Institute Echelon Insights of 1,029 likely voters conducted between October 23rd to 26th found that 72% of those asked would be not willing to volunteer to serve in the armed forces if America would enter a major conflict. Only 21% said that they would be willing to fight for America if a major war broke out. Now, why is this all happening? Well, I'd say it ties to what I talked about before. You know, normally patriots, people who love their country, are the fighting force of a nation, especially when you have a military like ours in the United States, where it's volunteer-driven. The patriots, the people who love America, they are the ones who would fight for the country. They are the ones who would have their children fight for the country. They are the ones who love the country enough to defend the country. And so what happens when you demonize patriots? What happens when you make it out that patriots are extremists? What happens when you target their religion, you target their values, you undermine their history, you tell them that everything they stand for is evil, while they become unwilling to fight for the country? And I'd say this is the extreme mistake the Biden administration has made. They demonized patriots. They made people out to be ashamed of their past, and now that the country needs people to join the military, people are not doing it. And if a major war were to break out, 70% of Americans are no longer willing to fight. Now, remember back in May when FBI whistleblowers Stephen Friend, Garriott O'Boyle, and Marcus Allen testified before Congress about the FBI's weaponization? Here, watch this. We'll go into it further.
I'm sad, I'm disappointed, and I'm angry that I have to be here to testify about the weaponization of the FBI and DOJ. Weaponization against not only its own employees, but against those institutions and individuals that are supposed to protect the American people.
Now, you have even more whistleblowers coming forward to Congress and exposing how high-ranking members of the FBI are targeting and trying to force out agents based on their political beliefs, basically because they seem like a Trump supporter. Here's the Washington Times on it. It says that a Marine and other military veterans at the FBI have been accused of disloyalty to the United States. Why, you might ask? Well, accused of disloyalty, quote, because they fit the profile of a supporter of former President Donald Trump. according to 2 disclosures sent to lawmakers on the House Judiciary Committee. It says other signs that an employee was a right-wing radical and disloyal to the United States, according to Ms. Perkins and Mr. Veltri, were failures to wear a face mask, refusing to take the COVID-19 vaccinations, and participating in religious activities. It says in another instance, Ms. Perkins attempted to revoke the security clearance of a Bureau employee she knew was a Marine veteran, but information showed that the initial allegation against the employee were unfounded according to the disclosure. Now, what is happening with this? How is it that anybody who voted for or supported Donald Trump, the former president of the United States, who won really some of the most votes in the entire history of this country, anybody who supported him is now deemed an extremist, is now being targeted by the FBI, is labeled as anti-American, as not being a patriot? Anybody who refused the draconian requirements of COVID-19 vaccinations, anybody who refused to surrender their rights and wear a face mask, talking about my body, my choice, and bodily autonomy, anybody who did that is deemed somebody not worthy of security clearance, is deemed as somebody who is unpatriotic towards the United States. I would argue that people who have those values, who would not surrender basic freedoms because the government just tells you to, really represent more of what this country has stood for its entire history, stand for the values that this country is supposed to represent. And it's those people who stand by the Constitution, who defend the Constitution as their oath requires them, who are the true patriots of this country. And it's those people who are being demonized. What happens when you demonize them? Again, it's the same thing you're watching happen right now. And on that note, this is a trend that's been going on from the very beginning of the Biden administration. Here's a reminder. January 2021, Biden's inauguration. Here's USA Today. No stone unturned. All 25,000 National Guards troops for Biden's inauguration to undergo extra vetting. And if you remember what the context of that was, he was worried that some of the people guarding the Capitol, guarding his inauguration, he was worried some of them might be loyal to President Donald Trump. Now, remember what they did when they surrounded the entire White House and the Capitol building with a large fence? When they put military checkpoints in? When they didn't let people attend the inauguration? We watched it on TV like some spectacle. That was not a normal inauguration. That was not normally how a president is sworn into office. That is not how this country normally works, let alone trying to vet people for their political viewpoints. Last I checked, we're a democratic republic, a constitutional republic. And based on that, of course, republic being a representative democracy, people choose their leaders. We select who represents us in the halls of Congress. And if you want to demonize people because they select somebody who's not currently in power, that's not the system of government we have. And if you want to vet people and demonize people for disagreeing with you politically, again, in a system that is based on the concept of people agreeing or disagreeing and casting their votes as such, that goes against the basic system of government in the United States and the government laid out in the U.S. Constitution. And notably, it's only gotten worse. This is Undercover DC this year. It says the FBI's Richmond Division would like to protect Virginians from the threat of white supremacy, which it believes has found a home within Catholics who prefer the Latin Mass. You hear that?
Oh,
if you're
my
a Catholic
God.
and you prefer the Latin Mass, they're labeling you as a white supremacist. It says an intelligent analyst within the Richmond field office of the FBI released a new Finnish intelligence product dated January 23rd, 2023 on racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists, what they call RMVEs, and their interests in radical traditionalist Catholics, or RTCs. You hear that? If you are a Catholic and you hold on to the traditional beliefs of your religion, you could be labeled a radical traditionalist, or they have the label RTC, Radical Traditionalist Catholic. Now, it says the document assesses with high confidence the FBI can mitigate the threat of radical traditional Catholics by recruiting sources within the Catholic Church. They're treating Catholics like terrorists, in other words. And this was an agenda that the establishment media have been pushing for a while, by the way. Here's Politico, 2021. It says, for decades, the U.S. government has been engaged with faith leaders in Muslim communities at home and around the world in an attempt to stamp out extremism and prevent believers vulnerable to radicalization from going down a path that leads to violence. Now, after the dangerous QAnon conspiracy theory helped to motivate the insurrection of the U.S. Capitol, remember this is Politico, and many participants touting their Christian faith, and evangelical pastors throughout the country ache over the spread of conspiracy theories among their flock and its very real human toll, it's worth asking whether the time has come for a new wave of outreach to religious communities, this time aimed at evangelical Christians. Last I checked, Christians were not strapping bombs to themselves and blowing up random crowds of people. Last I checked, Christians weren't driving through crowds of people in large trucks trying to kill anybody they could. Last I checked, they weren't tearing down fences, murdering and raping thousands of people. Last I checked, they were not guilty of these types of extremism that they're being compared to. But here we are right now where they're being hunted and categorized and labeled and investigated in ways as if they were. And remember, this wasn't just talk. The agencies, the federal agencies, they were acting on this type of rhetoric. Here's Epoch Times. It says the chair of the House Judiciary Committee has subpoenaed FBI Director Christopher Wray for all records relating to a leaked internal memo that proposed developing sources in traditionalist Catholic parishes to inform on potential violent extremists in such houses of worship. And it says, in an April 10th letter attached to the subpoena, Jim Jordan noted that the committee's investigation of that January 23rd memo, which is since repudiated by the FBI, had revealed that it was produced by at least one undercover agent, and that despite leadership's claims to the contrary, the Bureau intended to act on the memo's recommendations. Remember, they were denying it. They were saying, oh, we had no intention to act on it. We didn't want to do anything with it. This is just disinformation, false accusations, conspiracy theories. It turns out they lied about that. Here's Jim Jordan's letter to Director Wray. Jim Jordan wrote, based on the limited information produced by the FBI to the committee, we now know that the FBI relied on at least one undercover agent to produce its analysis, and that the FBI proposed that its agents engage in outreach to Catholic parishes to develop sources among the clergy and church leadership to inform on Americans practicing their faith. It says this shocking information reinforces our need for all responsive documents, and the committee is issuing a subpoena to you to compel your full cooperation. That was to, remember, FBI Director Christopher Wray. Now, in America, under the Constitution, again, we have religious protection. Under the Constitution, the government, not religion, is forbidden from interfering with religion. When we talk about the separation of church and state, that does not mean religious believers cannot engage in the government. It does not mean that religious believers can't run for office. It doesn't mean that people based on their faith can allow their faith to inform the values that they try to represent. Instead, it means the government should not be interfering with religion. The government should not be infiltrating Catholic churches and monitoring people. This type of totalitarian, draconian policy is what you saw under the Soviet Union. This is not what America is. And if you want to note, again, why the military is having trouble recruiting patriots, remember what happens to people in the military who are patriots. You know, we just talked to Navy SEALs who stood up against COVID mandates. By the way, and by doing so, won court cases on it because it turns out that they were right. It turns out their constitutional rights were being infringed by those types of mandates. And by refusing to acknowledge and go along with policies that violated the Constitution, they were actually upholding their oath. The oath they take when they swear themselves into the U.S. military to protect the country the Constitution from enemies both foreign and domestic. By refusing to go along with things that they believed violated the Constitution, even when it meant facing personal harm, even when it meant being insulted, even when it meant that their religions would be criticized, even when it meant that they would lose out and their families would be punished, they still stood by their oath to the American Constitution, and that meant, of course, based on court decisions that have determined that the SEALs were right, that meant that the military was forcing them, or trying to, do things that violated the Constitution. And take that in terms of the religious persecution taking place as well. Remember the special feature I did a while back, talking about how the military, through the COVID mandates, was targeting Christians. It was the same type of policy. The refusal to acknowledge, for example, religious exemption. The refusal to acknowledge standards that have been practiced by our military since the time of George Washington. The throwing out of precedents. The throwing out and ignoring of constitutional protections. Now, on this note, I would say that we're in very serious times. What happens again if you do not recognize patriots? What happens again if the people who want to fight for this country, to defend what this country is, what it represents, again enshrined in the U.S. Constitution, what happens when you demonize that? Well, people don't want to join. And I'd say that right now, really, the country's in pretty dire straits. Let me show you some headlines. Hot Air says, Washington Post scoop, Hamas wanted major war. And this is what I have been talking about for a while. The intention of what they did, the terror attacks on Israel, I personally believe was part of a ploy to drag America into a major war. Turns out that's what they wanted, according to Washington Post. Here's another one, Newsmax. Russia ramps up attacks on key cities in eastern Ukraine. They're trying to draw us in. North Korea's up to new funny business. It says here, North Korea closing embassies around the world. They're saying amid suspected financial crisis, but I'd say it's probably something else. The CCP, the Soviet, well, Russia, and of course North Korea, Iran, these countries are working together against the interests of the United States, and they have plots against the United States. And as this happens, of course, we have Xi Jinping coming to visit the U.S. right now, trying to make business deals while doing things like this behind the scenes. Now, I would just say again, you know, America is facing a crisis, and the worst policy you could adopt when your country is facing a crisis is to demonize the people who love their country and would be willing to defend their country. And the ironic nature of extremism is not that people are coming out to fight. The ironic nature of this is that people are now unwilling to fight.
Oh man, look at it. This is types of crap that needs to be fixed in this city. I'm not even sure where the hell I'm at. Down here close to Memorial Drive and I-20. How the hell is somebody in a wheelchair supposed to use this crap? Jesus, crying out loud. Now I gotta go back, because they can't fix a sidewalk in Atlanta.
Publicly denouncing the target and in some cases threatening violence.
I feel really afraid. They use hateful words.
They will make life very uncomfortable for those who speak ill of China.
And reaching out to law enforcement only goes so far. Social media platforms have sent out widespread bans to eradicate the accounts, but malicious actors create new ones en masse daily. The State Department describes it as part of Beijing's strategy to silence critics of the Chinese regime around the world, an effort the CCP pours billions of dollars into funding.
That's why my YouTube channel
ago, but federal prosecutors and Meta linked
having a problem.
Chinese police in recent months. President Biden will soon meet with Chinese leader Xi Jinping in San Francisco. Ahead of the talks, victims of Beijing's human rights abuses are speaking out to condemn the regime. Joining us now is NTD's White House correspondent Iris Tao, reporting from the APEC summit.